is mind? What is consciousness? For almost 6 decades now, mind and consciousness have driven me, but lack of progress has frustrated me. Sure, cognitive science has made significant discoveries, but about what the mind does, not what the mind is. Many say there's no difference. When we know all the mind does, we will know, ipso facto, all the mind is. I'm not convinced. That's why I seek new ways to think about mind and consciousness. I've been thinking about a theory called the extended mind, that in some real sense the mind ranges beyond the head, encompasses more than brain. To discern what mind and consciousness really are, can extended mind help? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. The extended mind was proposed in 1998 by philosophers Andy Clark and Dave Chalmers. For years, I and others dismissed the idea as clever but metaphor. Where does the mind stop and the rest of the world begin? Clark and Chalmers asked. They liked arguments that the meaning of our words just ain't in our heads, and extended this externalism about meaning into an externalism about mind. They proposed an active externalism based on the dynamic role of the environment in driving cognitive processes. Recently, frustrated by failure in comprehending the mind, I took a fresh look at the extended mind. For almost 2 decades, I'd wanted to speak with Andy Clark, but it never seemed to work out. But when I met Dave Chalmers at a conference on the physics of the observer organized by FQXI and held in Banff, I jumped at the chance to ask him about extended mind. Dave is a leading philosopher of mind who reignited interest in a non-materialistic conception of consciousness. I've known Dave for almost 20 years, and I'm always ready to hear more. Dave is an old neuroscientist who dealt with neuroanatomy, neurophysiology. I've read with great interest your work with Andy Clark on the extended mind, and I think, that's a very nice metaphor. But you take it more seriously than metaphor, and I don't understand why.
One thing that's uncontroversial, I think, is that the tools we use, the technology we use, has started to offload a lot of the functions of the mind from our brain to our environment. So take my smartphone.
Sure.
My iPhone here. I used to have to remember phone numbers with my brain.
Right.
Now I don't know the last time you did that, but yeah, they're all these days. They're all in the phone.
Great.
That brain space is being freed up for something else, and the memory role is being played here. So the conservative view would be, this is just a tool that the mind uses. But I think the more radical view, and the view of the extended mind that I endorse, is that this phone is actually becoming part of your memory, so that in the old days, I used to have a memory of a phone number in my brain. We'd say that's part of my mind, an unconscious part, to be sure, when I'm not actually thinking about it. The phone is playing a precisely analogous role to the role that the biological memory was playing. So if we say that my biological memories were truly memories, that is part of the mind, then my phone is likewise storing my memories, part of my mind. That's to say, there's no privileged border of the skin and the skull when it comes to the mind. All what matters is the role that it plays.
I see the distinction you're making between the two cases, but I don't see a fundamental difference. It just seems like a semantical way that you're dealing with memory. Sure, the memory is now on that phone, but that doesn't mean that phone is literally part of the my consciousness. It's a tool that I had. No difference in that phone than if I wrote it down on a piece of paper or on a rock as a caveman. I wrote it on the wall.
I actually completely agree with you that the phone is not part of my consciousness. And I'm inclined to think my consciousness is mostly internal. But there's a lot in the mind that's not part of my consciousness. Consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg. Most of what I know, where I grew up, my parents, phone numbers, beliefs about geography, they're not in my consciousness at any given time, but they're still part of what I believe. They're part of what I remember at some level. So what I want to say is the phone is analogous to that. What's, the giant background of the mind outside of consciousness. There's a lot of stuff stored in my brain. Well, the phone is basically playing the same kind of role in the exosystem of consciousness, contributing to consciousness. Now, every now and then I'll look up a phone number and I'll think about it, will enter my consciousness. And at that point, the information might enter my brain. That's like recalling a memory from outside consciousness and bringing it into consciousness. But we want to say that that memory was still part of your mind before it entered consciousness, maybe because of its potential effects on consciousness. What I want to say is that the phone or Google or the internet can, in principle, play the same role that biological memory was playing, part of the mind, if not part of consciousness.
So what would follow from that if I would give you the more radical interpretation of an extended mind?
What would follow, I think, is that we need to be a bit more generous about what we count as mental. That's interesting already for philosophy, but if you start to think about consequences, I mean, maybe, for example, there are moral consequences. If you take away my phone, you might have thought, okay, well, that's a form of theft. That's not so good. It's stealing. But on this view, you're actually taking away part of my mind. It's more a form of maybe assault or something. You're taking away part of my person. And I think actually as this technology becomes more and more integral to our existence, I think then it really does come to take on more of that personal, moral status.
And so do you see this becoming more and more fundamental to our concept of personhood or selfhood?
I still think I'm a Cartesian at core. I think there's an inner conscious self at base of all of this, but our ordinary concept of the person and the self includes a whole lot of stuff. It includes the unconscious mind, it includes the body and so on, all kinds of stuff which are connected to that inner conscious mind. And I think we're basically finding that's a very expansive notion, and that if that concept of the self and the person can bring in the unconscious mind and can bring in the body, it can also bring in parts of the environment. So I think one needs to conceive of ourselves as creatures which are not just narrowly limited to some point in Cartesian space, but as creatures that really more fully inhabit the world in a more distributed way.
At first hearing, the extended mind seems uncontroversial, closer to trivial than to revelatory. Sure, things external to our skulls relate to how we think. In a way, everything does. Yet, Dave uses extended mind to distinguish mind, which involves the external environment as well as the brain, from consciousness, which is all internal. That seemed obvious, but I hadn't before focused on this distinction between mind and consciousness. Suddenly, I wondered, could extended mind be more meaningful than I had dismissively supposed? More than metaphor? Was I getting it? Still, I wasn't sure. There must be more. After speaking with Dave, I was now determined to meet Andy. And as luck would have it, or synchronicity if I were so disposed, some months later I was visiting the University of St. Andrews in Scotland discussing philosophical theology, and to my pleasant surprise, I realized that Andy was just up the road, so to speak, at the University of Edinburgh, where he holds the chair in logic and metaphysics. Although Andy didn't mix with my current crowd, philosophers of religion, I was determined to sneak off and meet him. Andy, I know you are pioneering this concept of an extended mind, and I want to understand it because I must admit an initial predisposition to be an internalist. The only things real about consciousness and mind are things that are in the brain and internal to myself. So how can you convince me that things outside have a legitimate place in really understanding the mind as opposed to an environment in which the mind operates?
I think there are three different ways into this conclusion. Each of them is kind of sufficient on its own, and when you take them together, I think you have a pretty strong argument. So the first way in is just philosophical. It's just to raise the question, why should the boundaries of the brain be some sort of magical membrane outside of which stuff doesn't count as cognitive, but inside of which it does count as cognitive? Because if you think about the kinds of role that stuff outside the head can play, then it seems rapidly clear that if something inside the head was playing that role, then very often we would regard that as part of cognition. So there's a sort of a challenge. Are you just being sort of biological shell chauvinist or something like that? An example might be some nice experiments on what happens if you give people Botox and ask them to read sentences that are emotion-expressing sentences. It turns out that if you make the facial muscles more rigid than they normally are with Botox, then people are slower at reading and understanding sentences that express emotional events that would normally have a bodily expression. Interestingly, you can even speed up people's reading and comprehension of those sentences by giving them something that increases facial fluidity. So you can push this in both directions. So these loops through what the body is doing are playing some sort of role in enabling us to do stuff like understand these sentences. Okay, so we could move on to another way of getting at this sort of conclusion, which would be the sort of socio-technological avenue. So as time goes on, we humans seem to wrap more and more interest in stuff around ourselves. We find ourselves able to do more and more things. For example, if you're an artist, you might begin to use sketch pads or complex software programs to layer things one on top of the other. Under those conditions, we can solve problems, produce works of art that we couldn't otherwise produce. If you then turn around and say, yeah, but all the cognitive work is being done by the bit that's inside the head, then it's not really quite so clear why we shouldn't be able to do this just by doing stuff inside the head. But the route that I like best, actually, interestingly, is an ethical route. So one of the things that first got me interested in this back in the 90s, and this is when the original paper here was first being written with Dave Chalmers, co-author of the Extended Mind paper. I was working at Washington University in St. Louis. One of my colleagues, Caroline Baum, was an occupational therapist, and she had populations of Alzheimer's patients who were living in the inner city. And when they filled in the questionnaires and did the tests, there was no way that they should be able to function alone in the environments that they were nonetheless living in. But when she went to their houses and looked, their houses were very beautifully structured with kind of post-it notes in the right place, lots of routines for going out and getting a bus to go and pick up food and come back with the food. So what she ended up thinking was that, in a way, these well-functioning patients' minds were kind of distributed across their environments. If you had reached into one of those environments and changed it, or done what was being done a lot in those days, which was taking those people out of those environments and sticking them into care homes, basically you reduced their cognitive functioning by a huge amount. So there is this kind of thought that sometimes interfering with what looks like our environment is doing something so profound to us that we should think of it as interfering with ourselves. I might just mention one more example here, which is Patrick Jones, a Catholic deacon working in Colorado. And he has a kind of traumatic brain injury from falling repeatedly off his mountain bike, I think. What's happened is that he's been able to create huge webs of Evernote structures and using lots of little bits of off-the-shelf software. And he holds down a job as a working deacon in Colorado Springs. But if he left the room and then came back into the room, he'd have to consult his iPhone to know what you'd been talking about, what the things were. But that's what he does. That's how he holds it together. And I think that to not recognise that that's now kind of part of what it is to be Patrick Jones is to do a kind of ethical disservice to who and what we humans can be.
You have something called the parity principle. How does that work?
So the parity principle is if, as we look at some cognitive task, something is going on outside the head, such that if it were inside the head, we'd regard it as cognitive, then, until proven otherwise, we should give it the benefit of the doubt and count it as cognitive. So people say, look, your iPhone doesn't work like your brain, your notebook doesn't work like your brain, where's the parity? But it was supposed to be parity of opportunity, not parity of process.
So when I hear all this, I mean, everything makes sense, but my reaction is that it sounds like it is a very large number of distinctions, but without a fundamental difference. What are the predictive insights that we can get from extended mind that is counterintuitive or something beyond that which is overtly obvious?
Yeah, it's a good challenge. And actually, in the end, I came to think that cognitive science and maybe the sciences of the mind in general had pretty well bought everything that really mattered about the story. That's to say, they bought the idea that there are these complex interweavings and entanglings between brain, body, and world, so that if we want to understand how we solve any particular problem or how we can have the kinds of minds that we do have, then you have to attend to how all of this stuff works together. If at that point someone really wants to dig their heels in and say, I'm going to paint only the stuff that goes on in the brain with the sort of brush of cognition, and all those other entangled bits I'm going to call non-cognition, I got to a point where nothing apart from the ethical argument was seemed sufficient. From an explanatory point of view, you very often need to think about the properties of the body and the world if you want to understand what the brain's doing, because they've been slotted together so neatly. So there's an explanatory reason for thinking that you want to look at them all, but that doesn't mean you have to call them all cognition. The only one that I think really bites for calling them all cognition is the ethical argument that otherwise you might think that damaging Patrick Jones's Evernote records is somehow just a crime against his property rather than a crime against a person.
Yeah, but the notes are not part of his cognition. But what is part of his cognition is the desire to have the notes. I wouldn't think less of him.
So you wouldn't think less of him, but in the eyes of the law, as it were, hurting, stealing, destroying something that someone just desires a lot is rather different to destroying part of them. So, you might be in love with your iPhone, and, I would think, okay, that's a really bad thing to destroy that iPhone because, it is such a loved object.
Right.
But that's rather different to thinking that destroying that iPhone is tantamount to destroying part of your cerebral cortices.
Right.
Certainly when I talk to quite a lot of cognitive scientists, the notion that cognition might extend is taken to be reasonably unproblematic. People start to worry when you say the mind extends, and I think that's because mind and consciousness are being kind of tied together. So it might very well be that a reasonably deflationary understanding of the extended mind claim is warranted and might be the right thing to do.
I think I get it. The mind requires intimate interaction with its environment. But Andy happily does not propose the extended mind as the master key for unlocking the mysteries of mind or the secrets of consciousness. I like that. No grandiose theory of everything mental. Rather, extended mind is a modest insight into cognition, what it means to sense, think, feel, broadening our understanding of how the mind works. With whom can I explore this further? I know just the fellow. Raymond Tallis is a polymath philosopher, neurologist, humanist, social critic. He has long interest in mind and consciousness, with not the slightest reticence to challenge current belief. Ray is also in the UK, and we arranged to meet in St. Andrews.
I think the extended mind is a corrective to the notion that somehow the mind is tucked away in the brain inside the darkness of the skull. Basically, a mind is something that is aware of something other than itself. So minds have always been extended, and in fact the direction of extension is multidimensional. We basically participate in a community of minds, and that community of minds, of course, includes artifacts, it includes home, landscapes, it includes, most importantly, other people, groups of people, affiliations, and so on and so forth. So there's nothing brand new about discovering the mind is somehow outside of the brain, indeed outside of itself. It is outsideness.
My problem with it is that everything outside the brain has to be encoded within the brain. So is this a distinction without a difference?
I guess the brain is as it were, the final common pathway, the necessary condition of all of these things. But you won't understand minds by just looking at brains.
Okay. So I think the question is differentiate between how you understand the totality versus very specific pathways or the mechanisms by which it occurs. And you're saying that is not the whole story.
It most certainly isn't the whole story. And even the phrase, the mechanisms by which it occurs, I think is more problematic than people realize. The notion that there are mechanisms underpinning aspects of mental activity takes us dangerously back to gathering the mind back into the darkness of the skull. And I just think that is not how things are.
So that rejects the so-called identity theory.
Very much so. Both type identity, where you identify types of experience with activity in certain parts of the brain, and token identity theory, where a particular thought is a particular activity in the brain.
Right, but the brain is absolutely necessary for those.
Yeah.
But it's necessary but not sufficient. So what do you have to add to what's necessary to get it to be sufficient?
Well, I think we just look at the fact that whatever the mechanism, it is clearly the mind is already outside of itself. It isn't to be tucked back into the brain. We don't know how it is, and I think that's one of the fundamental questions. And although it's nice and encouraging that people are now regarding the mind as incorporating things outside of the brain, indeed outside of the body, particularly the notion that we all belong profoundly to a community of minds, I don't think that really has taken us any further into understanding exactly how this is possible.
So what you're saying is that the theory that extended minds takes prosthetic devices, whether it's a smartphone that is literally outside that encodes my memory, or if that smartphone were reduced to a chip and literally planted in my brain, that argument being to justify extended mind, you're saying that is a very limited understanding of what extension really is.
Absolutely. Our minds are intrinsically extended. I mean, I'm having a conversation now, and clearly you are part of my mind and I'm part of yours.
That's nice metaphor that we're engaging and we're in each other's minds, but that's not what's happening. I mean, I have my independence of you.
Sure.
I find that I'm engaged in the conversation, but we're not cohabiting the same mind. So I'm seeing everything you're saying as an enrichment, but not a fundamental characterization of what the mind is.
I was thinking of yourself as a device. You're much better than a phone in that sense, and in terms of accessing or extending my mind. Of course, the major extension comes from the fact, for both of our minds, comes from the fact that we use language.
Okay.
And that through language, clearly, we have access to a semiosphere, a gigantic world of signs and symbols. And you're a very good device, as it were, for increasing my access to that semiosphere. Another means, better still, better even than an iPhone.
And that makes sense, but it's the question of enrichment versus fundamental substance of what it is, essence. Enrichment versus essence.
I think that's where you're right, and that's why something fairly specific, like an iPhone or other technologies, doesn't address the sense of the extendedness of our minds.
So that would argue for the fact that this concept of extended mind is weak on both sides. It's not good enough to represent the entirety of the information available to us, and it also is exaggerating what the mechanism is, because it's not really affecting the mechanism at all.
I think that's true, and I think it's driven partly by a false analogy with, say, prostheses. You know, when you have an artificial leg, it sooner or later becomes part of your body. You incorporate it. That's not the same as our relationship to some technology, such as an iPhone or a wallet or whatever.
So develop that thought further, because that's interesting in terms of how we figure something like a prosthesis is part of our body and it becomes us versus something that's external.
It is. I mean, when we're walking, it definitely is part of our gait, my gait. Clearly, I can take it off and put it to one side, and then it ceases to be part of me. And I think that partly is what's driving the notion of the extended mind beyond embodied cognition, which is the notion that these things, as it were, become part of our personhood almost. I don't think they do.
You mentioned embodied cognition, so from your perspective, what is that, and how does it articulate with extended mind?
I think they're both part of the recovery from the idea that the mind is the computational activity of the brain. So embodied cognition at least acknowledges that the brain is attached to a body, that we really are inescapably embodied. The extended mind goes beyond that, into the artifacts that form part of our immediate environment. And I think they're both correctives, but I don't think they really deliver what we need when we're trying to understand mind, which itself is intrinsically extended, not localized.
I treasure small insights into big questions. Because big questions remain questions, they may embed intractable problems or logical confusions buried within. That's why whenever I learn something new about a big question, I'm appreciative, I'm excited. Extended mind teaches me about the mind. For one, it distinguishes mind from consciousness. It's no secret that mind and consciousness are not identical, but extended mind sharpens the difference and expands the territory of the mental. Can something have a mind and not be conscious? How about post-singularity artificial intelligence, AI, a mind, but not conscious? Next, the mind is more than what inhabits the head. First came embodied mind. The mind as we know it needs a body. Now comes extended mind. The mind recruits the environment in its service. Extended mind enriches understanding of mind, though it doesn't even try to explain consciousness. I'm happy with baby steps, getting closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.